Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1858, the remote settlement known as Black Hollow became the center of events that would challenge the understanding of even the most seasoned investigators of that era. The case of Martha Grundwald and her daughters represents one of those rare historical episodes where extensive documentation exists, yet every answer only deepens the mystery. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely what was discovered, but what remains unexplained to this day, despite multiple investigations spanning nearly 7 decades. Black Hollow derived its name from the peculiar darkness of the limestone hollow where it sat, a geological depression in the Ozark Highlands, approximately 18 miles southwest of what would later become the town of Forsyth, Missouri. The hollow itself descended nearly 200 feet below the surrounding ridges, creating a natural basin where sunlight arrived late and departed early. Dense stands of oak, hickory, and pine crowned the ridges, while the hollow floor remained perpetually damp, covered in moss and ferns that thrived in the constant shade. A spring-fed creek wound through the settlement, its waters stained dark brown by tannic acid from decaying leaves, giving the water an appearance that locals compared to strong tea or, more ominously, to blood diluted in water. By 1858, Black Hollow consisted of 11 families, most of German immigrant stock, who had arrived in Missouri during the previous 2 decades seeking cheap land far from the coastal cities where they had first landed. The settlement maintained minimal contact with the outside world. The nearest proper town, Ozark, lay a full day's wagon journey to the north over roads that became impassable during the spring rains and winter snows. A circuit preacher visited 4 times yearly. A traveling merchant came through perhaps 6 times in a good year. Otherwise, the families of Black Hollow existed in profound isolation, dependent entirely upon their own resources and the meager economy they had established among themselves. The Grundwald family had arrived in Black Hollow in the spring of 1851. At that time, the family consisted of Heinrich Grundwald, his wife Martha, and their 4 daughters: Greta, who was then 14 years old, Louisa, aged 11, Katrin, aged 8, and the youngest, Elsa, who was merely 5. Heinrich Grundwald had purchased 160 acres on the western edge of the settlement, land that included both ridge and hollow, with access to the creek and a small cave system that extended into the hillside. He paid for this land in full, a fact noted with some surprise by the other settlers, as it suggested the family possessed resources beyond what their appearance indicated. Heinrich himself was described in the diary of Johann Kessler, one of the settlement's founding families, as a quiet man of perhaps 40 years, thin and weathered, with the calloused hands of someone accustomed to physical labor. Martha Grundwald, however, drew more attention. Even in 1851, she was a woman of considerable size, described by Kessler as being perhaps 250 pounds, an unusual sight in a region where most settlers lived on the edge of hunger. Her size alone marked her as different, suggesting either a metabolic peculiarity or access to food supplies beyond what the frontier typically provided. The Grunwald daughters were noted for their beauty and their unusual silence. Greta, the eldest, possessed what the Reverend Samuel Thorne described in a letter dated August 1852 as an almost unnatural composure for a girl of her age, with pale blonde hair and eyes that seemed older than her years. The younger girls shared similar features, all fair-haired and pale-skinned, quiet to the point that several settlers remarked they had never heard any of the Grunwald children laugh or raise their voices in play. Heinrich Grunwald established his family in a cabin he constructed with unusual care and speed. Unlike most settler cabins, which were rough single-room affairs, the Grunwald home was built with a stone foundation, 2 rooms, and a cellar that extended unusually deep into the hillside, practically adjoining the natural cave system that penetrated the ridge behind their property. Heinrich worked with focused intensity, completing in 3 months what typically took settlers a full year. By autumn of 1851, the Grunwald farm was producing, though neighbors noted that Heinrich seemed to plant unusual crops, including several varieties of herbs that none of the German settlers recognized. The death of Heinrich Grunwald in March of 1853 marked the beginning of the truly disturbing chapter of this history. According to the account published in the Springfield Sentinel dated April 7, 1853, Heinrich's body was discovered by his eldest daughter Greta at the bottom of a steep ravine approximately half a mile from the family cabin. The official cause of death was determined to be a broken neck sustained in a fall, though several details troubled those who examined the scene. Sheriff William Hodges, who traveled from Ozark to investigate, noted in his report that Heinrich's body showed signs of having been moved after death, and that the location where he was found seemed inconsistent with the injuries he had sustained. More troubling still was the fact that Heinrich had apparently been dead for at least 3 days before his body was discovered, yet Martha Grunwald had not reported him missing or sought help from neighbors. Martha's explanation, as recorded in Sheriff Hodges's report, was that her husband had spoken of checking their trap lines in the hills, and that she had assumed he was engaged in that task. She claimed she had not been concerned by his absence, as he sometimes stayed out overnight when pursuing game. This explanation seemed insufficient to Hodges, particularly given that it was early March, with snow still on the ground and temperatures at night dropping well below freezing. The sheriff noted in his report that Martha showed little emotional response to her husband's death, a fact he attributed to possible shock, though he recorded his discomfort with her demeanor. The settlement attended Heinrich's burial with the appropriate solemnity, and initially, the neighbors of Black Hollow attempted to provide the support traditionally offered to a widow. Several families brought food and offered assistance with the spring planting. However, these gestures were met with what Johann Kessler described in his diary as a cold courtesy that discouraged further interaction. Martha thanked the neighbors, but made clear she required no assistance. She had her daughters, she said, and they would manage their affairs. What followed over the next 5 years constitutes one of the strangest periods of decline documented in frontier history. The Grunwald farm did not fail in the typical manner of a widow's struggling homestead. Instead, it seemed to transform in character, becoming something other than a normal frontier dwelling. Neighbors began to notice unusual patterns of activity, details that individually might have been dismissed but collectively created a portrait of profound strangeness. The first notable change involved Martha Grunwald's physical appearance. Despite being a widow who should have faced privation, Martha seemed to increase in size. By the summer of 1854, Johann Kessler estimated her weight at over 300 pounds. By 1856, she had become so large that she was rarely seen outside her cabin, and when she did appear, she moved with obvious difficulty. This dramatic weight gain occurred during a period when the family's visible means of support had not increased. They maintained their garden and appeared to hunt and fish, but there was no indication they possessed resources beyond what other settler families had, and most of those families lived in a state of near constant hunger. The daughters, in contrast, remained thin. Greta had grown into a young woman of striking appearance, tall and pale, with an almost ethereal quality that several settlers found unsettling. The younger girls followed similar patterns of development, all remaining slender to the point of appearing undernourished. Yet they continued to work their land with apparent vigor, often seen in the early morning hours or at twilight, rarely during the full light of day. The pattern of debt began in late 1854 and is documented in the account books of Solomon Pierce, the traveling merchant who serviced the Ozark region. Pierce's ledgers, which were later examined by authorities, show that Martha Grunwald began purchasing supplies on credit in November of 1854. The purchases themselves were unusual in their specificity. While most settlers bought basic staples, flour, salt, sugar, and coffee, Martha's orders included large quantities of lard, butter, bacon, dried fruits, and expensive items like imported molasses and white sugar. The quantities she ordered suggested consumption far beyond what a family of 5 would require. Pierce's personal journal, donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1901, provides additional disturbing details. In an entry dated January 1855, Pierce wrote that he found his visits to the Grunwald cabin increasingly uncomfortable. Martha would meet him at the door, her bulk now so great that she seemed to fill the doorframe, and would conduct business there rather than inviting him inside, as was customary. Behind her, Pierce claimed he could sometimes see the daughters moving in the darkness of the cabin, though they never came forward or spoke. The interior of the cabin, he noted, had a peculiar smell, sweet and rotten simultaneously, that made him eager to conclude his business and depart. The debt accumulated steadily. By the summer of 1856, Martha Grunwald owed Pierce nearly $200, an enormous sum equivalent to several years of a laborer's wages. Pierce's journal indicates he was growing concerned about the debt, but hesitated to press the matter, partly because Martha continued to assure him that payment would be forthcoming, and partly, Pierce admitted, because something about the woman and her household filled him with an instinctive dread that made him reluctant to challenge her. It was in the autumn of 1856 that the most disturbing aspects of the case began to manifest. Neighbors noticed that Greta, the eldest daughter, was no longer seen around the property. When Johann Kessler inquired about the girl during a chance encounter with Louisa at the creek, the second daughter replied that Greta had gone to stay with relatives in St. Louis. This explanation satisfied no one, as it was well known that the Grunwalds had no relatives in America, Heinrich having been estranged from his family in Germany before his emigration. More troubling still was Louisa's manner when delivering this information, which Kessler described as mechanical as though she were reciting words she had been instructed to speak. Over the following months, the remaining daughters were seen less frequently. When they did appear, neighbors noted they seemed to move in a peculiar manner, keeping to shadows and avoiding direct conversation. The Reverend Samuel Thorne, during his quarterly visit in December 1856, attempted to call upon the Grunwald household to offer spiritual comfort and guidance. His letter to the Episcopal Diocese in Springfield, dated December 28, 1856, describes an encounter that left him deeply troubled. Thorne wrote that Martha Grunwald refused to allow him into the cabin, speaking to him through a partially opened door. The woman's size had become so extreme that Thorne initially had difficulty recognizing her as human, describing her face as having become a small feature in an expanse of flesh. She assured him that the family was well and had no need of religious services, a statement that violated every custom of the frontier, where visits from the circuit preacher were anticipated as both spiritual and social occasions. More disturbing to Thorne was a sound he heard from within the cabin, a low rhythmic creaking that he could not identify, but which filled him with an inexplicable sense of wrongness. He departed the Grunwald property with what he described as a feeling of spiritual oppression, as though he had been in the presence of something actively hostile to divine grace. The winter of 1856 to 1857 was particularly harsh in the Ozarks. Snow accumulated to depths of 3 feet in the hollows, and temperatures remained below freezing for weeks at a time. The families of Black Hollow endured this period as they always did, largely isolated from each other, burning through their wood stores and living on preserved foods. It was during this period of isolation that subsequent investigators believe the most critical events occurred, though exactly what transpired remains a matter of speculation and horror. When spring arrived in late March of 1857, neighbors noticed that smoke no longer rose from the Grunwald cabin's chimney. This alone was not unusual, as warmer weather reduced the need for heating fires. However, there was no other sign of activity at the property. The garden, which should have been prepared for planting, remained untouched. No one saw the daughters at the creek or in the woods. The cabin itself seemed abandoned, though it was impossible to be certain given the family's long-established pattern of isolation. It was Solomon Pierce who forced the issue. The merchant arrived in Black Hollow in early May 1857, determined to collect on the debt Martha Grunwald owed him. According to his journal, Pierce approached the cabin with considerable trepidation, his unease growing as he noticed the complete absence of any living presence. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, moving in the breeze, and the smell that emerged from within was so powerful and foul that Pierce later wrote he nearly abandoned his investigation then and there. Pierce called out for Martha Grunwald and received no response. After several minutes of indecision, he pushed the door fully open and peered inside. What he saw in that moment, he later testified, would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The interior of the cabin was in a state of chaos that seemed somehow organized, as though the disorder followed rules incomprehensible to a rational mind. Furniture had been moved to the walls. The floor was stained with substances Pierce could not immediately identify. And in the center of the main room was a great mound of quilts and blankets, beneath which something of enormous size lay motionless. Pierce fled the cabin and rode immediately to fetch Johann Kessler and 2 other men from the settlement. The 4 of them returned to the Grunwald property armed with rifles, though none could have said what threat they anticipated. Together they entered the cabin and approached the mound of fabric. When they pulled back the quilts, they discovered the body of Martha Grunwald, or what remained of her. The description provided in the official report filed by Sheriff William Hodges, who was once again summoned from Ozark, strains the limits of believable testimony. Martha Grunwald's body had achieved a size that Hodges estimated at over 500 pounds. However, it was not merely her size that shocked the investigators, but the condition of the corpse. Martha's body showed signs of having been partially consumed, though whether this had occurred before or after death could not be determined. Large sections of flesh had been removed with what Dr. Ezekiel Thornton, who examined the remains, described as unusual precision, as though whoever or whatever had done this had been selective in their choice of which portions to take. More horrifying still were the markings found on Martha's skin. Dr. Thornton's medical report, preserved in the Missouri State Archives, describes intricate patterns carved or somehow inscribed into the flesh of the dead woman's arms, legs, and torso. These markings resembled no writing system Thornton recognized, though he noted they seemed deliberate and purposeful, rather than the random work of scavengers or decay. The doctor estimated Martha had been dead for at least 2 months, possibly longer, which would place her death sometime in February or early March of 1857. Of the 4 daughters, there was no sign. Their clothing remained in the cabin. Their few personal possessions were undisturbed, but the girls themselves had vanished completely. Sheriff Hodges organized an immediate search of the property and surrounding area. What searchers discovered only deepened the mystery. The cellar beneath the cabin extended far deeper than the original construction should have allowed. It appeared that someone had excavated further into the hillside, creating a passage that connected the cabin's cellar to the natural cave system behind the property. This passage was barely wide enough for a grown man to navigate and descended at a steep angle into complete darkness. The walls of this excavated tunnel showed marks that suggested systematic digging over a long period, and the soil that had been removed was nowhere to be found, as though it had been carried away and dispersed. 3 men, including Sheriff Hodges, entered the cave system following this passage. Their exploration, documented in Hodges's subsequent report, revealed a series of chambers extending perhaps 200 feet into the hillside. The caves showed evidence of regular human presence. Someone had carved crude steps in certain places. Small alcoves had been hollowed out of the walls. And throughout the cave system, the searchers found disturbing remnants of occupation. In the deepest chamber they could safely access, the searchers discovered what appeared to be a primitive altar or work surface, a flat limestone slab approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. On and around this slab were found items that Sheriff Hodges cataloged with obvious distress. Fragments of human bone that appeared to have been burned, remnants of clothing that the settlers identified as having belonged to the Grunwald daughters, and a collection of metal implements whose purpose Hodges could not determine, but which filled him with instinctive revulsion. Most disturbing of all was a ledger book found in a waterproof metal box, hidden in a crevice near the altar. This book, written in a combination of German and English, appeared to be some form of record or diary, though its contents defied easy interpretation. The entries, which began in November of 1854, detailed transactions, but not of any conventional kind. Martha Grunwald had recorded dates, quantities, and cryptic notations that subsequent investigators have never successfully decoded. One entry, dated March 3, 1857, was the last in the book and consisted of a single sentence in German. "The final measure is paid, and the covenant is sealed." The ledger contained other disturbing elements. Pressed between certain pages were locks of hair, 4 in total, each a different shade of blonde. These were later determined to match the hair color of each of the 4 Grunwald daughters. Beside each lock of hair was a notation in Martha's handwriting. For Greta, the sum of $60. For Louisa, $70. For Katrin, $80. And for Elsa, the youngest, $90. The total of these amounts, $300, exceeded the debt Martha owed to Solomon Pierce by precisely $100. The search for the Grunwald daughters extended over the following weeks. Every family in Black Hollow and the surrounding region was questioned. Notices were published in newspapers throughout Missouri and neighboring states. The sheriff's office in Ozark received several reported sightings of young women matching the daughters' descriptions, but each lead proved false or inconclusive. It was as though the 4 girls had simply ceased to exist. The investigation expanded to include the history of the Grunwald family prior to their arrival in Black Hollow. This inquiry, conducted by a detective hired by the territorial government, revealed troubling gaps in the family's background. No record could be found of Heinrich and Martha Grunwald entering the United States through any of the major ports. They had appeared in Missouri in 1851 with no documented history, and Heinrich's payment for the Black Hollow property had been made in gold coin of unusual vintage, struck in German states that no longer existed by 1850. More troubling still were discoveries made by a German-speaking investigator who examined the few documents found in the Grunwald cabin. Among Martha's possessions was a small book, leather-bound and extremely old, written in an archaic form of German that the investigator identified as dating from the 16th or 17th century. The book appeared to be some form of folk medicine or herbalist's guide, but it contained passages that disturbed the investigator sufficiently that he refused to provide a complete translation, stating only that the text dealt with practices he considered both dangerous and evil. The property itself was shunned after the investigation concluded. No one from Black Hollow would approach the cabin, and within a year the structure had been torn down by settlers from a neighboring area who used the timber for their own buildings. However, even these practical-minded individuals reported unease while working at the site, describing feelings of being watched and a persistent smell that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, a sweet, rotten odor that no amount of air could dispel. The cave system was sealed by order of Sheriff Hodges, who had heavy timbers placed across the entrance and stones piled to block access. This measure proved temporary. Within months, the barricade had been disturbed. The timbers moved aside as though by considerable force. Who or what removed them was never determined. The cave entrance was sealed again, and again it was opened. After the third attempt to close the caves failed, the settlers of Black Hollow ceased their efforts, instead choosing to simply avoid the area entirely. In the years following the discovery of Martha Grunwald's body, Black Hollow experienced a steady decline. Families began to leave, claiming the hollow had become unlucky or cursed. By 1865, only 3 families remained, and by 1870, the settlement was entirely abandoned. The reasons given were typically practical economic difficulties, poor soil, isolation from markets, but those who interviewed the departing families often noted an underlying unease that seemed to drive the exodus as much as any practical consideration. The case might have faded into obscurity, one more unsolved frontier mystery, except for events that occurred nearly 2 decades later. In the spring of 1876, an academic expedition from the University of Missouri arrived in the Ozarks to study the region's cave systems. The expedition was led by Professor Martin Wheaton, a geologist and natural historian who had heard vague accounts of interesting geological formations in the area once known as Black Hollow. Professor Wheaton's journal, published posthumously in 1894, provides a detailed account of what the expedition found. The team, consisting of Wheaton, 2 graduate students, and a local guide, spent 3 days exploring the cave system behind the abandoned Grunwald property. The caves proved more extensive than anyone had realized, with passages extending possibly half a mile into the ridge. The expedition mapped several chambers and documented various geological features of interest. It was in the deepest chamber they accessed that the expedition made discoveries that connected directly to the events of 1858. This chamber, which Wheaton estimated was 300 feet beneath the surface, showed clear evidence of human modification. Someone had carved symbols into the walls, hundreds of them, covering nearly every available surface. These symbols matched the markings that had been found on Martha Grunwald's body, according to descriptions Wheaton had obtained from surviving documentation of the original investigation. More disturbing were the remains found in this deep chamber. The expedition discovered portions of 4 human skeletons, all apparently female, all showing evidence of extreme trauma. Professor Wheaton, who had some anatomical training, estimated the remains were approximately 20 years old, which would place them in the correct time frame to be the Grunwald daughters. However, the condition of the bones troubled him deeply. In his journal, he wrote that the bones showed marks suggesting they had been systematically processed, boiled clean, and showing evidence of having been carved or inscribed with the same symbols found on the walls. One of Wheaton's graduate students, a young man named Thomas Pritchard, had what could only be described as a mental breakdown while in this chamber. According to Wheaton's account, Pritchard became convinced that something was present with them in the darkness, something that breathed and moved despite being invisible. The student began screaming and had to be physically restrained and removed from the cave. He never fully recovered his mental equilibrium and was eventually institutionalized, dying in 1889 without ever providing a coherent explanation of what he believed he had experienced in that subterranean chamber. The expedition collected several artifacts from the cave, including bone fragments, samples of the inscribed stone, and photographs of the chamber walls. These materials were deposited with the University of Missouri and were studied by various scholars over the following decades. None could provide a satisfactory explanation for the symbols or their meaning, though several noted disturbing similarities to pre-Christian religious iconography from Central Europe, particularly traditions associated with what some termed the Old Hunger or the Great Feeding, practices that were deliberately obscured or destroyed by the spread of Christianity. In 1903, a follow-up investigation was conducted by Dr. Helena Marsh, a physician and anthropologist from Chicago who had become interested in the case through her research into frontier medicine and folk practices. Dr. Marsh spent 6 months in the Ozark region interviewing elderly individuals who had been young adults in the 1850s and might remember the Grunwald family or the events at Black Hollow. Her published monograph, Frontier Atrocity and Folk Belief, The Black Hollow Incident, remains the most comprehensive scholarly examination of the case. Dr. Marsh's investigation uncovered several previously unknown details. She located a woman named Emma Schneider, who in 1858 had been Emma Hoffman, the 8-year-old daughter of a Black Hollow settler family. Now, elderly and living in Springfield, Emma provided testimony that added crucial context to the case. She remembered the Grunwald daughters well, particularly Louisa and Catherine, who had been close to her in age. Emma described the girls as beautiful but profoundly sad, with a quality of resigned hopelessness that she found disturbing, even as a child. More significantly, Emma recalled an incident from the autumn of 1856, shortly before the Grunwald daughters began to disappear. She had encountered Louisa alone at the creek, and the older girl had spoken to her with unusual directness. Louisa had told her that sometimes mothers love their children so much that the love becomes a kind of hunger, and that hunger could never be satisfied no matter how much was fed to it. The comment had made no sense to young Emma at the time, but it had remained in her memory for nearly half a century, accruing layers of possible meaning as she aged and understood more of human darkness. Dr. Marsh also discovered financial records that provided additional context to Martha Grunwald's debt. The expenses Martha had accumulated were not merely for food, though food represented a large portion. She had also purchased, through Solomon Pierce, large quantities of lime, salt, and various chemicals whose purpose Pierce had not questioned. These materials, Marsh noted, were consistent with what might be needed for preserving organic materials, though to what end Martha might have been using them remained unclear. Perhaps most chillingly, Dr. Marsh found evidence suggesting that the Grunwald case was not unique. Through systematic research in historical archives, she identified at least 4 other cases in German immigrant communities across Missouri, Illinois, and Wisconsin between 1845 and 1870 that showed similar patterns: a widow of unusual size, the disappearance of children, discoveries of human remains in circumstances suggesting something beyond normal murder. The similarities were sufficient to suggest either a pattern of related incidents or the operation of similar beliefs or practices among certain immigrant groups. Marsh's research also touched on the medical aspects of Martha Grunwald's condition. She consulted with physicians specializing in metabolic disorders and was able to determine that Martha's extreme obesity, while unusual, was not impossible through natural means. However, the rapidity of her weight gain, occurring during a period when her resources should have been constrained, remained medically puzzling. One physician Marsh consulted suggested the possibility of a tumor or glandular disorder that might have caused both the weight gain and severe mental disturbance, though he acknowledged this was speculative and could not account for all aspects of the case. The question of what Martha Grunwald believed she was doing has occupied researchers for over a century and a half. The most disturbing theory, advanced by Dr. Marsh and supported by subsequent scholars, is that Martha operated under a belief system derived from pre-Christian European folk traditions, practices that had been suppressed but not entirely eliminated during the Christianization of Germany and other Central European regions. According to this theory, Martha believed that through certain acts she could pay debts not merely in the mundane economic sense, but in a spiritual or metaphysical manner, settling accounts with forces or entities whose nature can only be speculated upon. The symbolism of consumption and payment recurs throughout the fragmentary documentation. Martha's extreme obesity, occurring alongside the disappearance and apparent destruction of her daughters, suggests a belief that she could literally consume her children to satisfy or transfer some form of obligation. The precision with which her own body was later found partially consumed creates a horrifying symmetry, as though whatever force or principle Martha believed she was serving ultimately demanded payment from her as well. Some researchers have suggested a more prosaic explanation rooted in mental illness. According to this view, Martha Grunwald suffered from a severe psychotic disorder, possibly exacerbated by the isolation and hardship of frontier life. Her extreme obesity represented a form of compulsive eating disorder, while her treatment of her daughters reflected delusions of a persecutory or command nature. The elaborate staging found in the cave could have been the product of a disordered mind attempting to create meaning through ritual. This explanation, while more palatable, struggles to account for certain physical evidence, particularly the apparent cooperation or submission of the daughters over an extended period. The fate of the 4 Grunwald daughters remains officially unresolved. The bones found in the cave were consistent with being the remains of 4 young women of appropriate ages, but definitive identification was impossible given the technology of the era. No alternative explanation for the daughters' disappearance has ever been advanced. They left behind all their possessions, disappeared in the middle of winter from an isolated location, and were never seen or heard from again. The only logical conclusion is that they died at or near their home, yet the exact circumstances and even the precise location of their deaths remain uncertain. In 1925, a final significant investigation took place. The site of the Grunwald cabin and the associated cave system was visited by a team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had recently expanded its scope to include historical cases of interest. The investigation was prompted by reports of missing persons in the Ozark region that showed superficial similarities to the Grunwald case. The FBI team spent 2 weeks examining the site, reviewing all available documentation and interviewing the few remaining individuals who had any connection to the original events. The FBI investigation concluded that while the Grunwald case was certainly real, it represented an isolated incident of what the report termed frontier psychopathy, exacerbated by cultural isolation. The report acknowledged the case's disturbing elements, but attributed them to Martha Grunwald's severe mental illness, combined with the extreme isolation and lack of mental health resources available in 1850s frontier communities. The report made no mention of the possibility of organized practices or belief systems underlying the events, an omission that some researchers have found suspicious and suggestive of official reluctance to acknowledge certain historical realities. The physical site of the Grunwald property has undergone various transformations over the decades. The area once known as Black Hollow is now part of a larger tract of privately owned forest land. The cave system remains accessible, though it is not publicized, and most local residents avoid the area. Amateur spelunkers who have explored the caves in recent decades report that the deepest chambers remain marked with the symbols first documented by Professor Wheaton in 1876, though many are now obscured by mineral deposits and the natural processes of cave formation. In 1967, a local historian named Robert Castleman published a small book titled Lost Settlements of the Ozarks, which included a chapter on Black Hollow. Castleman had grown up in the region and had heard oral traditions about the Grunwald case that had been passed down through generations. According to these traditions, locals avoided the Black Hollow area not merely because of its association with the Grunwald tragedy, but because of ongoing strangeness. Hunters reported that animals avoided the area. Hikers described feelings of unease and disorientation. There were accounts, which Castleman treated with appropriate skepticism, of lights seen in the hills at night and sounds emanating from the earth that resembled human voices in distress. Castleman's work inspired renewed interest in the case, and in the 1970s, several amateur researchers attempted to investigate further. Most abandoned their efforts after cursory examination of the available documentation, which had become scattered among various archives and private collections. One researcher, a graduate student named Michael Torrens, spent a summer in 1972 attempting to locate and map the full extent of the cave system behind the former Grunwald property. His field notes, never formally published, describe a labyrinthine network of passages far more extensive than earlier investigators had realized. In several places, Torrens found evidence of recent human presence, though who had been in the caves and for what purpose he could not determine. He abandoned his research after becoming ill with what doctors diagnosed as an unusually virulent respiratory infection, though Torrens himself believed his illness had environmental rather than microbial origins, related to what he described as a pervasive sense of wrongness that permeated the deepest portions of the cave system. The question of Martha Grunwald's motivation remains the central mystery of the case. Was she operating under the influence of specific cultural or religious beliefs imported from Germany? Was she suffering from a severe mental illness that manifested in these particular ways due to the isolation and stress of frontier life? Or, as some researchers have hesitantly suggested, was there something about the location itself, about Black Hollow and its limestone caves, that influenced or enabled the events that occurred there? This last possibility is the most unsettling because it implies that the Grunwald case was not entirely a product of human psychology or belief, but rather a response to something environmental or locational. Several researchers have noted the geological peculiarities of the area. The limestone formations contain unusual mineral deposits. The water from the local spring has a chemical composition that differs from surrounding sources. Some have speculated about the possibility of naturally occurring compounds that might have psychoactive effects, though no evidence of such compounds has been discovered despite several analyses of water and soil samples from the area. The legacy of the Grunwald case extends beyond its immediate mystery. It has become a touchstone for discussions of frontier violence, immigrant communities, and the limits of historical knowledge. The case appears in academic journals, true crime compilations, and folklore collections. It has been cited in discussions of everything from mass hysteria to cannibalism to cult practices. Yet, despite this attention, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. What drove Martha Grindwald to do what she apparently did? What happened to her 4 daughters in the final months before their deaths? What was the meaning of the symbols found carved into stone and bone? What was the nature of the debt Martha believed she was paying, and to whom or what did she believe she owed this debt? These questions have no definitive answers, only theories and speculation built on fragmentary evidence and the disturbing consistency of that evidence across multiple investigations spanning 7 decades. The site today is marked by nothing except the natural features of the landscape. The cabin is long gone. The cave entrance, though accessible to those who know where to look, is unmarked and difficult to find. The families who once lived in Black Hollow are dispersed or dead. Their descendants scattered across the country with little knowledge of or interest in their ancestors' brief residence in that dark hollow in the Missouri Ozarks. Yet the case endures in the historical record, a puzzle that continues to trouble anyone who examines it closely. In recent years, a few researchers have attempted to use modern forensic techniques to extract additional information from the physical evidence that still exists. DNA analysis of the bones found in the cave might definitively establish whether they belong to the Grunwald daughters. Chemical analysis of the symbols carved into stone might reveal what tools or techniques were used to create them. Database searches might connect the Grunwald case to other similar incidents that have not yet been linked. However, these efforts face significant obstacles, not least the scattered nature of the evidence and the reluctance of current landowners to permit excavation or detailed examination of the cave system on their property. The most recent academic treatment of the case appeared in a 2019 journal article by Dr. Sarah Winters, a historian specializing in 19th century American folk practices. Dr. Winters argued that the Grunwald case should be understood in the context of what she termed survival anxiety among immigrant communities on the frontier, the pervasive fear that survival was impossible, and that extraordinary measures, even horrific measures, might be necessary to ensure continuation. According to Winters, Martha Grunwald may have been acting on beliefs that her family's survival required sacrifices so profound that they violated every civilized norm, but which, in her disordered understanding, were necessary and even righteous. This interpretation, while sobering, still does not fully account for the physical evidence. The systematic nature of what was found in the caves, the precision of the markings, the apparent cooperation or submission of the daughters over an extended period all suggest something more organized than simple psychotic breakdown. Whether that organization reflected Martha's internal mental structure or drew on external traditions and beliefs remains a matter of scholarly dispute. What can be stated with certainty is that in the winter of 1858, in a dark hollow in the Missouri Ozarks, something terrible occurred. A mother and her 4 daughters, isolated from the world by distance and circumstance, engaged in or were subjected to acts that defied understanding. The mother died in circumstances suggesting both perpetrator and victim status. The daughters vanished, leaving behind only bones bearing marks that no one has satisfactorily explained. And the debt that Martha Grunwald claimed to be paying, the debt she apparently paid with the lives of her children, remains as mysterious now as it was to the horrified settlers who first uncovered evidence of these events over a century and a half ago. The case of Martha Grunwald and her daughters stands as a reminder of how much about the past remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. The historical record preserves facts, but cannot always provide meaning. We know what was found in that cabin and in those caves. We know the dates and the names and the circumstances, but we do not know, and perhaps cannot know, what drove these events or what Martha Grunwald truly believed she was accomplishing in that dark hollow far from the civilized world, paying debts with flesh and blood to powers or principles that may have existed only in her mind or may have been something far more real and far more terrible.